at 5 o'clock, 5:15 to join, and then 10 minutes, and then you can ask. No, it's a debate. It's not a lecture. For example, we had, should the honors list be thrown to the bin? We had things on Trump. We had things on should there be faith schools be scrapped, etc., etc. So it's and there's especially a gentleman who very often he prepares. The way he presents the subject he's fantastic, David, isn't he?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's very good. It's every Tuesday afternoon, and it's called Tea with the Rabbi.
Oh, lovely. You need something like that actually at the moment, don't you?
Yeah. No, and they do all the services on Friday night on Zoom, once a month on a Saturday. This week they had every night a Hanukkah candle trail in somebody's house at 6 o'clock, isn't it?
Oh,
yeah. So
fantastic.
Tonight is the last night.
Anybody can join.
Yeah.
And so we've got people from around the country who used to live in the area and now have moved away. They've stayed friends, and it's lovely.
That's one of the joys of Zoom, isn't it? That you can meet up with people all over the world, all over the country. One of the few joys, well, no, it's not one of the few joys, as we have to use Zoom, but that has been fantastic.
Yeah. By the way, on the art subject, yesterday I heard a lecture. I didn't have time to Google the lecturer at all. He's called Ian Cox. I don't know if any of you know him, if he's a NatFast registered lecturer or whatever, but he was absolutely fantastic. He spoke on Italian furniture, Baroque 17th century Italian furniture. He had amazing slides, and he was a very, very good lecturer. So if any of you who are on Chiltern NatFast committee, if you want to look him up, his name was Ian Cox.
Debbie's got it nailed.
And the other one that we have regularly is somebody called Patrick Bade.
How do you spell his last name?
B for brother, A, D for David, E.
Oh.
But I haven't a clue if they are what they are. That's a completely different organization that I do. They have, it's unbelievable. They call it the Lockdown University. It was started, I think it was started back in March, but I didn't hear about it until probably August time. I don't know, might even be September, I don't know. And they have, it was started by a South African lady called Wendy Fisher. Her parents are immensely wealthy. They have a foundation, and the whole thing is funded. It's free of charge. The whole thing is funded by this foundation. And they usually have about, now they have to move from a Zoom to a webinar, because if you are more than 1,000 people attending, then it doesn't work very well. And they have every day at 5 o'clock, except Friday afternoon. So it's either something twice a week, usually Wednesdays and Sundays, it's the art type thing. And it follows, like we had Rembrandt, we had Rubens, and that was this Patrick Bade who did it. And then you have, and the other times it's more related to Jewish history, sort of, you know, she went through, I didn't hit the beginning. I mean, she went through Nazis, Poland. Last week we had the, you know, the Jews in the Ukraine between 1919 and 1939. Or you have, you know,
wow.
And Ruth, you say anybody can join?
Anybody can join. I can send you the link.
Hello,
and I think I have your email address, Wendy. I don't know if I have it or not.
I think you have, yes.
Yes, and I'm sure I did, because I think I contacted you at the beginning of this lockdown.
Yes, absolutely.
And
The
the thing which is amazing is this lady, the one who started to organize it, she attends every single time. She greets the people, she greets the lecturer, and she lives between New York, Los Angeles, South Africa, and London. And it's absolutely extraordinary.
Oh, fantastic.
And they have occasionally something in the evening, but it's not a lecture, it's more like a debate, sort of two people talking to each other. So one is very often is this South African judge, and they interviewed somebody who was a clerk to the Supreme, the American, Ruth who died. So they interviewed this young person who is a lawyer in New York, and they have something. I'll send you the link.
That's fascinating. I'd love to do that. I'd love it if you send the link.
You can look at it out of curiosity, once, and you don't. And every Sunday night you get the program of the week.
Hello, Pam and Mike.
It says she's joining.
That's Sarah.
How are you?
Can I, excuse me, everybody, can I cut across? Thank you. Maureen Grover, hello. I understand you've been having trouble joining the meeting, but you're in now.
Shut everyone down a minute.
Which is Maureen?
Oh, she's gone off now.
38 people.
Can I suggest that you ask people if they're going to have conversations amongst themselves? It's background noise for the rest of us. So if they're going to talk amongst themselves or take a phone call, can they mute themselves?
So that's okay with everybody. We're about to start as well.
Yes.
Nico, you're right.
Just going to start anyway, aren't we?
So, hello, Maureen. I can see that you've had trouble joining, but I'm glad you've made it. Excellent. Okay.
Where is she?
In the middle there.
No story.
And is it disconcerting for anyone else that I think that, I've lost Heather, but I've got Marianne on my left and Brian on my right, but it's different for all of us, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Oh, dear, but how nice to see everybody. And you can see some of the committee have silly hats on. That is not what happens when you join the committee. So consider joining.
Can I take mine off?
Where?
Oh dear.
Yeah, my iPad's a bit flaky, and I don't know because we've got the two going. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's just about time, isn't it?
Well, if John could open his video, I think there you are. Thank you, John. I think we can start, can't we?
Yeah.
Brian, you're watching.
My iPad might go off again. So.
Do you know an Abby, by the way?
Yes, that's our granddaughter.
She just entered.
Good, thank you. Oh, I'm pleased she did. I sent that at the last minute. Okay, everybody, welcome to our special lecture today, which will be our last lecture of the year. And I want to give a very warm welcome to all our regulars and to the new members who have joined the Society this month, which has been great. We have a special New Year's treat for you if you make a diary note of the 14th of January, when we will be boarding a bus at 10 o'clock to go into the Vintners Hall in London and have a virtual tour, which will start at 10:30. So it will be great to see you all. And if the Chalfont people want to join us, that would be a £5 donation. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather.
Yes?
I just said thank you, Heather.
Okay. For those of you who haven't yet paid your subscriptions, they are due by the 1st of January, and we thank all of you who have made your subscriptions. Finally, I'd like to wish you all a very safe and happy festive season, and we look forward to 2021 being back to normal as soon as possible. So enjoy your coffee and mince pies, and I will now hand over to Debbie to introduce our speaker.
Hello, everyone. Could I ask Brian to mute us all?
Right. You seem to be mostly unmuted by the look of it.
Oh, is everyone muted?
Yeah.
I need to mute myself.
Oh, there's one. Right, yeah, let's make sure. Yeah.
Okie doke.
Right.
Lovely.
Okay.
Yes, welcome to First Timers. Spread the word. If you do have anyone who you think might be interested in joining us as members, I hope you're still finding the lectures are as good in the hall, sometimes better to see more detail, I think, on screen. Also remember to submit your questions via the chat button, and we'll read them out at the end of the lecture. So today's lecturer is John Apps. He was brought up at the mouth of the Clarence River in northern New South Wales. His first degree was in history and economics, but he later went on to study organizational development and industrial psychology. He worked mainly with blue-collar workers, increasing job satisfaction and productivity. His main interest since retiring is sailing, and in particular, long-distance, single-handed voyaging in small, basic boats. If you look at him now, in the background, there are 3 medals that were given to John on each of his arrivals in Newport, Rhode Island. They're medals of honor for those who single-handedly cross the Atlantic Ocean. Wow. So, crossing the ocean, I hand over to John for the extraordinary voyage of Mary Bryant. John.
Thank you, Debbie. I'll now share my screen, or attempt to share my screen. Come on. Here we go. Okay. Now, I just want to get rid of that. What we're going to talk about is Mary, and Debbie mentioned that I'm interested in voyaging across oceans. Well, that's one of the reasons I'm going to talk to you today about Mary Bryant, who in 1791 made a 3,500 statute miles or 3,256 sea mile voyage in an open boat, you may have heard that Bligh from the Bounty also made a similar voyage, and oddly enough they end up in exactly the same place, which is Kupang in West Timor. Bligh started from a different location, but we'll actually see that later. But what I want to why won't that work? There we go. Who was Mary Bryant? She was a Cornish lass from Foy in Cornwall, and we're actually looking at a place called Plenty Money Cove, and it was called Plenty Money Cove because of the fact that a Spanish galleon was wrecked offshore and all the money ended up on that little. So if anyone in Foy wanted a bit of spare change, they just went down to Plenty Money Cove. Oddly enough, today, other than the demographics of the people who live there, there's been very little change in Foy. In the 18th century, you could have gone to the King of Prussia Inn, and you could have gone to other inns, the Ship Inn, for instance, and there's very little changes. The major changes, if you look to the right of your picture, you'll see a ship. Today, you'll rarely see a ship in Foy or on the Foy River, but you will see lots and lots of sailing boats. Foy was fairly inaccessible. To leave or arrive at Foy, you either had to go by ship out to the English Channel or up the river to Lostwithiel, and then you had the main road through Cornwall then to go to wherever you're going. Mary Broad was born, and her maiden name was Mary Broad, was born in April 1765. Her father, William Broad, was a mariner, mother, Grace Broad, and she had an older sister, 2 years older, called Grace, and who was known as Dolly. I've got a lot of stuff here on my screen. I'm trying to read through it. The main industry in Foy at that time was, in fact, a pilchard or sardine fishery. and it was largely exported to the Mediterranean via Santander. One of the interesting things about the English or the British fishing industry, of course, is that so much of it goes to Europe, and even in the 18th century that occurred. And you might remember that William Broad was a mariner, and he was probably on one of those ships that were taking the pilchards or sardines to Santander. The interesting thing about that, and if you think about Cornwall in the 18th century, was what were they bringing back? And of course, Cornwall's known for its smuggling, and we might talk a little bit more about smuggling a bit later. The pilchard season was summer and autumn. Everyone helped, including women and children. And as a result, Mary Broad would have actually been very involved in fishing as such, and would know something about fishing, and that once again, and boats. She probably could have helmed a boat very successfully. However, there were things going wrong in the mid-18th century. There was the Enclosure Act, which I'm sure you've all heard of, and of course they lost common land. And where did you graze your pig or your chickens or whatever if you didn't have common land? The tin and copper mines, which were usually one man or several men shows before they were industrialised by those terrible people from the Midlands coming down and buying them all out. And in 1785, there was a bit of a disaster there, probably global warming. A drought caused a wheat shortage, and also, for whatever reason, the pilchards failed that year. So what was poor Mary going to do? Her sister Grace, or Dolly, had actually gone into service, but Mary and Dolly were quite different people. And from everything I hear, Mary would not have been happy in service as Dolly was. However, somehow or other, she got to Plymouth. One of the interesting things about this story is there are big gaps. And one of the gaps is, how does a 18-year-old girl or 20-year-old girl go from, most people in these days never move more than 5 miles from home, and yet she makes a 35, 40-mile journey to Plymouth. And we know that because in April 1786, she was convicted of highway robbery, along with Catherine Fryer and Mary Hayden. They held up Agnes Lakeman, who was also injured in the attack, and they stole goods worth £11, 11 shillings, which included a hat, which was the most expensive thing, and jewellery. Debbie, when I was showing this to her before, complained about the fact that the girl wasn't properly dressed in this picture, but you'll notice she's got boots that go all the way up. One of the things I worry about is that we tend to glorify highwaymen and pirates and things like that. But really, what they did was no better than a mugger or robbery with violence. Now, one of the interesting things I came across when I was doing the research on this, a mugger was actually named after an Indian crocodile. So that's where they come from. 2 years before Mary was sentenced, a fellow called William Bryant, who was a fisherman, was accused of smuggling and assaulting a customs officer at the Bodmin Assizes. Now, one of the things that was known at that stage, that no one in Cornwall was ever convicted of smuggling. So, in fact, what William Bryant was convicted of was, in fact, taking the wages of 2 sailors by deceit, which he'd probably done as well, but that's what he was convicted for. And he was sentenced to 7 years transportation. But in 1784, they had nowhere to transport people to. So basically, he and Mary were put into the same prison hulk in Plymouth Harbour called Dunkirk. And they were, of course, old ships of the line that were basically, the masts were ripped off and they were just made into living quarters, prison quarters for convicts, or whatever you call them. Men were actually were sent ashore to work in irons, but women had nothing to do on board, and they remained on board. One of the ways the only way they could get any benefits, let's say, was to form a liaison with one of the guards. And there is evidence that Mary formed a liaison with one of the guards or someone. However, about this time, in fact, we had the Admiralty put together an idea to transport all these convicts, a proportion of the convicts to Australia. And both Mary and William Bryant, Mary Broad and William Bryant, were put onto the convict transport Charlotte, which was a chartered. In fact, most of the convict ships, with the exception of the two Royal Navy ships, were in fact chartered. Some of them were ex-slavers, which were ideal for what they were doing. And on the Charlotte, they were actually separated by bulkheads, and there was unlikely to be any communication between Mary and any of the men on board. One of the other people that appears at this time is a fellow called Lieutenant Watkin Tench, who in fact became probably the major historian of what occurred, or he basically chronicled what occurred in that in the New South Wales colony and also on the way there. He actually in his book mentions Mary on the Charlotte, because he was actually on the Charlotte with his detachment of Marines. The other thing he's known for was that he wrote after the French Revolution, which occurred a year or 2 years after the First Fleet left, of course. He wrote about the letters from revolutionary France. He was a follower of Rousseau and Thomas Paine, the rights of man. And interestingly enough, with such a liberal background, he actually ended up as a lieutenant general. So the Charlotte moves from Plymouth up to Portsmouth, where it joins the rest of the fleet. And as I mentioned, there were 2 Royal Navy ships there. One was the HMS Sirius, which was the flagship, and one was what was HMS Supply, which was always known as the Little Supply. So we imagine it was a very small, probably a sloop of war. And they depart Portsmouth in May 1787. They were very, very fortunate that both the colony of New South Wales and that First Fleet, that the man that was put in charge by the Admiralty was a fellow called Captain Arthur Phillip. He was by no means a Nelson. He was by no means a Horatio Hornblower. He was an administrator. He had served at one stage on half pay, when he'd been on half pay, you know, put ashore basically with the Portuguese Navy. And one of the things he'd done with the Portuguese Navy was take a load of convicts from Portugal across to Brazil. So he had actually experience. Now, he held up the First Fleet by up to 6 months because he was worried about scurvy. He basically was saying to the Admiralty, you can't send those people out to this far part of the world, the other side of the world, and expect them to survive. It's not like a 6-week voyage to America, which was where the convicts were going before. We've got to give them some form of protection against scurvy. And he basically held it up. He's also concerned about clothing and things like that, because he saw when they got to New South Wales, there was unlikely to be any supply of clothing. And you know, the Admiralty was not sympathetic to many of the things he wanted to do, but he finally got his way. The first port of call was Santa Cruz and Tenerife. Now, I specifically sailed here in 2017 because I'd read a very good modern history book by a fellow called Robert Hughes, who is probably better known as an art critic or art historian, but he'd written a book called The Fatal Shore, and he mentioned a prisoner who'd escaped at Santa Cruz and swam out to an island. I went looking for that island, but in Santa Cruz now, I can tell you it looks very different to the scene we see there. Next port of call was Rio de Janeiro. What I've actually done here is I've actually repeated exactly what's at the bottom of this watercolor drawing, which is, it basically says the city of San Sebastiano, Rio de Janeiro, Sirius and Convoy 1787. Between Rio de Janeiro and Cape Town, Mary Broad is delivered of a baby girl. She refuses to name the father. Now, one of the things I will be talking about, the first time that Mary became, after the 1790s, when she was quite famous in London, the first time she came to notice basically was what was known as a bodice ripper, was written in the 1930s. And one of the we have had a number of books since then that tend to perpetuate the theory that, in fact, Watkin Tench was the father of Mary's little girl, but in fact, there's no evidence to that effect. She named the little girl Charlotte, and of course, we know of Princess Charlotte, and George III, who was the sitting monarch at that stage, was married to Queen Charlotte, of course, but the ship was also called Charlotte, and that's what we think the girl was named after. The First Fleet arrives in Table Bay in Cape Town. Now, this becomes very important. Remember, most of those people on board, they're convicts, not the seamen. The convicts had never moved more than 5 miles from home. So far, they've travelled about 4,000 miles to another hemisphere completely. And the thing about Cape Town, it was the last centre of culture, let's say, or, well, could we call Cape Town culture? Last centre of civilization before they went out, and in old seaman's language, they would say, from here on, there be dragons. Probably very much like if we were sent to Mars, or probably even further Saturn, with little knowledge of what was going to occur. I feel very sorry for those convicts in terms of what they didn't know about what was happening to them. And we could also talk about their toilet buckets floating around their cabins or their prison cells. One of the things I want to talk about, most of those line colour, the watercolours, are in fact done by a fellow called Lieutenant William Bradley, who in fact was once again, like Watkin Tench, became very important in terms of the history of the early colony. A young midshipman of the 18th century, one of the things, the skills he would have been taught was to draw particularly skylines, and any form of drawing was highly prized in the Royal Navy, because if you got a chart and you wanted to find, for instance, Cape Town, there, in fact, the other side of the Cape of Good Hope, or Cape Point as it's known down there, is a place called False Bay, and it was called False Bay because people couldn't tell the difference between Table Bay and False Bay. And you may notice in the painting here that, in fact, there's very clear Table Mountain, Signal Hill, and also what's known as the Lion, which denotes Cape Town as such. And that would have been on the side probably of an Admiralty chart in 1788 or 1787 as it was. William Bradley also just happens to be an ancestor of mine on my mother's side, so I'm very proud of that particular thing. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a picture of William Bradley, but there is Bradley's head. If you've ever taken the ferry from Circular Quay across to Manly, which must be one of the most magnificent public ferry services in the world in terms of views, on your left as you went towards Manly, you would have seen Bradley's head. You may not have known that. It's still being fought over, though, between the New South Wales government and two branches of Bradley's family. Finally, in early January, mid-January 1788, the first fleet arrives in Botany Bay. Arthur Phillip, in one of his periods on shore, had been a farmer, and he's not impressed with the ability of Botany Bay to support the first fleet, particularly the convicts and all the Marines used to guard them. Unfortunately, of course, Botany Bay was recognised largely by Joseph Banks as being a wonderful source of new plant life. And as a result of all this wonderful plant life, which largely grew in sand, they thought it would support European crops, but Phillip felt differently. So in fact, he moved the whole first fleet around to a place called Port Jackson, which also had a source of water, something called the Tank Stream, which is still recognised in Sydney. And the colony is founded on the 26th of January 1788, which by coincidence happens to be the day that Australians celebrate Australia Day, or actually the native Australians celebrate Invasion Day, as they call it. Today, Port Jackson, which we saw before, looks very different. In fact, that's exactly the same scene. And you can see, of course, the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Opera House there, which would be the two iconic parts of Sydney today. The first thing that happened was the landing of the male convicts, not the female convicts at this stage. They brought the male convicts ashore to actually set up a camp and even build rudimentary houses as such. The female convicts were left on the ship. But when they were brought ashore, William Bryant and Mary Broad married, along with about 5 other couples. And there we see the Reverend Richard Johnson, who was in fact officiated those weddings. One of the interesting things about this, it was generally believed by the early, but particularly by the convicts and by some of the seamen and some of the Marines, that any marriage that occurred in New South Wales didn't count if you went back to Britain. So there was a concern greatly by Mary, in fact, that William Bryant, who was supposedly, once again, if we look at some of the bodice ripper stuff, was ready to leave as soon as his 7 years were up. Now, if you remember when he was convicted, which was 1784, his term would be up in 1791, and it would be possible, as the fact that he had experience as a seaman, that he may be able to find a position on a ship to go back to I was going to say the UK, but it'd be Great Britain, or Britain in those days, England. I want to mention a little side thing here, which is someone called the Comte de la Perouse. He turned up in Botany Bay on the 24th of January, which the first fleet was already there, even though they didn't move around to Port Jackson until the 26th of January. And his basic role is he'd been tasked by Louis XVI to do a Captain Cook and discover the world for the French as such. Unfortunately, he left Botany Bay in early February and disappeared from European history as such. There have been various investigations as to what occurred and where his two ships ended up, but that's probably the subject for another talk. There was a young Corsican artillery officer who applied to join La Perouse, but he was refused because he had no sea experience as such. And I wonder how the course of European history would have changed if Napoleon Bonaparte had been lost with La Perouse. La Perouse is better known now as a restaurant in Paris, and of course it was where Auguste Escoffier developed things like peach Melba, etc. It has 3 Michelin stars, but in my mind, it's probably a little too much for an Australian to be able to eat at La Perouse restaurant. Our culinary highlights run more to a pie floater from Harry's Cafe de Wheels in Woolloomooloo. It has 4 Michelin tires. We're talking about food. Food was absolutely critical to the new colony, and we only had one farmer, a fellow called James Roos, which was also spelt Rouse and was also spelt Rose. And in fact, Rose Hill in Sydney, which is where the racecourse is, was actually named after him. They had one fisherman called William Bryant. Most of the other convicts, there was a preponderance of people. We hear about sheep stealers and bread stealers. The women were largely ladies' maids who had stolen something from their mistress, or prostitutes. The men, it seemed to be we had a preponderance of forgers and counterfeiters. As a result, or what we go into the sheep stealers again, pickpockets, etc. But we had very few people who practically could run a farm or do fishing, and we only had the one. William Bryant and Mary also had experience as a fisher person and was very useful to William initially. Because of their importance to the colony, they were allowed to build their own hut, and that rather than live in convict quarters, they had a lovely little hut with their daughter, or stepdaughter in William's case, perhaps. Emmanuel Bryant was born in March 1790, 2 years after the first fleet had arrived, and the question might be asked at this stage, was everybody happy? Here they were living, the average Englishman later on would have had to pay £10 to get there. They got there for nothing, and they were living in quite, one of the best climates in the world, some people might say. However, William Bryant was caught selling some of the fish. He was allowed to keep a certain amount of the catch for himself, for he and Mary and his children to eat, but in fact he was caught selling it. He was his name was probably given to the governor, who was rewarding people who gave miscreants, people who reported on them, they were getting food, extra food. So William was reported for having sold his fish and received 100 lashes. From this point, in fact, we could probably look at the fact that everybody wasn't happy in terms of the Bryant household. They were actually put back into the convict quarters as well, which they weren't happy about. Particularly William was living with the men, and Mary and her 2 children were living with the women. Bryant was actually using the governor's own cutter for fishing, and a plan was hatched to steal it and escape. One of the interesting questions that comes up here is who hatched the plan. The bodice ripper genre of novels will tell you, histories will tell you that it was Mary who actually hatched that plan. It may have been because if we look at, remember William Bryant was due, his transportation, 7 years transportation, ended on 1791. We're now up to 1790. Mary may have been quite worried that he was going back to England by himself, leaving herself and 2 children in the colony. And she may have hatched the plan. It may have been one of the other people who went with them who hatched the plan. There's no actual history of it. It was kept very secret. The fact they were able to actually escape, the fact they were actually able to escape said a lot for their ability to keep everything secret. They had built they were given back their hut in the end because of the importance of the fishing to the colony, and they had built a hatch under the floor, which they were hiding additional food and things in, and we'll talk about some of those things shortly. Two other events occurred around this time. HMS Sirius, which had already made a trip to the Cape Colony and brought back food, was wrecked on Norfolk Island during a storm. Its anchor dragged and it was on a lee shore and it was wrecked. So suddenly Philip had no way of sending off his larger ship to get food. What in fact he did is he said that HMS Supply up to the Dutch East Indies and managed to charter a ship to act in Sirius's stead. The other thing that occurred is that the Second Fleet arrived in 1789, but one of the ships that was with the Second Fleet, HMS Guardian, which was the supply fleet, and it had a lot of food for the new colony, struck an iceberg south of Cape Town, returned to Cape, threw all the food overboard, returned to Cape Town, and as a result, there was a massive shortage of food in the colony in New South Wales. However, this Dutch ship that was chartered by Arthur Phillip, in charge of Captain Detmer Smith, like a lot of people, he was entranced by Mary. Now, as far as we know, once again, there was no sexual relationship at all, but because he liked Mary and he didn't like the officers, the governor or the officers that were running the colony, he sold William Bryant food, navigation equipment, and muskets, and these were hidden beneath the floor of his of their cabin as such. That, in fact, is a Dutch Snow. If you're wondering what sort of ship that is, you're probably not. The people who actually escaped: Mary Bryant, William Bryant, Charlotte Bryant, 4 years old, Emmanuel Bryant, 1 year old, James Martin, who we'll mention again shortly, James Cox, Samuel Bird. They were actually all from the First Fleet. From the Second Fleet, we had William Allen, Nathaniel Little, Samuel Brown, and William Morton. William Morton was a seaman also, and he acted as the navigator. Basically, if we look, what we've got there is both the Bounty voyage and its subsequent voyages, and also the escaped convicts voyage. And I can't find my mouse. Here we go. The black line is the escaped convict voyage. The red line here is the Bounty, in fact, going to Tahiti, picking up its breadfruit and starting to head back towards England. It's at this Tafua that the actual mutiny occurred, and Bligh was sent off in his open boat voyage, and that's the green line, and the actual subsequent voyage of the Bounty back up to Tahiti, where some of the Bounty mutineers remained with the local Tahitian women, and some of the mutineers picked up their favourite girls and took them. And what we don't really know is why they went all the way back to Tafua and then ended up in Pitcairn Island. That becomes a little more important later in this little story. But if you look at this journey here at 3,500 miles, now I know for a lot of yachtsmen around England, they tend to think, well, I've been all the way around the UK, and you know that's not such a big voyage when you look at that from Sydney Harbour down here, wherever it is, around to Kupang. But if we put that into context of Europe, fits into Australia, the whole of Europe fits quite easily into Australia, and you can see that that is a voyage that many of us wouldn't undertake unless we had a good cruise ship under us, but we probably wouldn't want a cruise ship now and catch COVID. The critical issue on their voyage was water, how they were going to get it, and basically they had 2 barrels as such that they could fill with water, but they were 11 people altogether, including 2 young children, and they were going into a tropical area, basically. So from Sydney, they were going north. Sydney is about 30 degrees, 32 degrees, 31 is south, and they were going up to about very close to the equator in Kupang. the first place they stopped was the Hunter River, which is probably better known these days for its wines than for good water and coal. We know it was the Hunter River because, in fact, they found sea coal, and the Hunter River area, Newcastle, as we call it, in New South Wales, became one of the major coal producing areas early on in Australia's history. It's not quite so clear where they stopped next, but it would appear if you read the journal, which was written by William Bryant, that it was a place called Port Stephens. And in William Bryant's journal, this is according to Bligh, and I'll explain why it was Bligh, he thought it was actually a superior place to Sydney Harbour, but they'd already established in Sydney, so they weren't going to move. And I dare say most of you have never heard of Port Stephens. William Bligh becomes important at this stage because he had actually, in 1793, he went to Kupang and found William Bryant's narrative of the whole voyage, and he had his clerk start to copy that narrative. And he'd also made notes in his journal, and one of the notes he made was that he felt that William Bryant was an exceptional seaman. But unfortunately, William Bryant's narrative as such was lost later as one of the East India companies, we don't know if it's the British one or the Dutch one, used the actual narrative that he'd written as wadding for cannon fire. And the whole thing was lost. But what Bligh retained was about a third. His clerk only copied about a third of William Bryant's narrative. And that takes us up to about Port Stephens, or a little beyond. After that, we were reliant upon something called the Memoranda of James Martin. James Martin was one of the people on the boat, and it was written later in Newgate prison. And one of the interesting things is that you can actually find this online. The handwriting has 5 different varieties, so we tend to believe that it wasn't actually written just by James Martin. James Martin was not a seaman, and as a result, the voyage becomes a little less well documented, or not as clearly documented as such. One of the things he does document is the number of times when they were going ashore for water and or food, they were chased off by Aboriginals. And it would appear that the further north they went, the fiercer the Aboriginals became. And this was also documented by an explorer who was English, but he was exploring Australia, a fellow called Kennedy, who went all the way up to Cape York. And he said basically as he went further, he had more and more trouble with the fierceness of the Aboriginals. Now they were chased off, and they were in desperate trouble in terms of water at one stage. They did get to a sand island. Once again, we don't know which sand island it was. It could in fact be the largest sand island in the world, which is Fraser Island, which is just a bit north of Brisbane. And Fraser Island does have a lake, a freshwater lake in the middle, and maybe they were able to get fresh water there. One of the things they did find on whatever the sand island was a lot of turtles, and they were able to catch those turtles. They had an absolute feast on those turtles. They dried the turtles and carried on their boat. They also, of course, drank the blood of the turtles and stored the blood as much as they could, because once again, it's as good as water. James Martin, or the various people who wrote his journal, talks a lot about storms and gales and bad weather and all this sort of thing. The bodice rippers genre of stories tend to write a lot about the fact that Mary was doing all the bailing and the men had all given up, and if it wasn't for Mary, they wouldn't have survived, etc., etc., which may be true, but there is no documentation to support that. All James Martin says is that Mary and the children behaved very well during the bad weather. When they got to the Torres Strait, and Torres Strait is the bit between Cape York, which is the bit at the very top of the east coast of Australia, and Papua New Guinea, the ethnicity of the Torres Strait Islanders is closer to the Melanesians of Papua New Guinea than the Indo-Europeans of the Aboriginals of Australia, and their craft are quite different. The Aboriginals only had dugouts, and they had chased them in their dugouts, but the Lakatoi, as it's called in Papua New Guinea, is in the Torres Strait, is quite different, as we see here. I actually put the little thing in brackets about cannibals because there's been no mention of that. But I was in the Australian Army. Well, I was after school. I joined the Australian Army and went to officer cadet school, and my first posting was to the Pacific Islands Regiment in Papua New Guinea. And one of our roles there was to show the flag and aid to the civil power and basically tromp around the country for 6 weeks at a time. And I remember sitting 10,000 feet up on the Owen Stanley range one day, talking to my little platoon headquarters group, which consisted of me, a sergeant, a radio operator, and my batman. It was my servant who looked after things while I went round and made make sure the platoon was all ensconced properly. He was from a place called Milne Bay, and I don't know if you can picture Papua New Guinea in your mind, but Milne Bay is the very eastern end, a little tail of Papua New Guinea that sticks out into the ocean there. And he was talking around this fire at 10,000 feet on the Owen Stanley about the glory days. And I said, his name was Angel Walkup. I said, Angel, what do you mean by the glory days? He said, oh, during the Australian gold rush, all the Chinese were coming down in boats and they'd wreck themselves on Milne Bay. He said it was absolutely wonderful. And I said, why? He said, our favorite food is Chinese. If you look at, one of the problems with this, I can't tell if anyone laughs. If you look at Torres Strait, it's not for the faint-hearted navigator. We've got on the right down here, we've actually got the tip of Cape York, and then you go, and if you know anything about navigation, you'll see that there's absolutely horror stretch through here. Bougainville, who was a great navigator in this area, his theory was that before you even thought about going through here, you waited till daylight. You never even attempted it at night. And that was the general thing. The fortunate thing about our convicts in their cutter, their naval cutter, was in fact it doesn't draw all that much, and if you do run aground, you can probably pull yourself off. And as a result, they made it through without any trouble, according to James Martin. What they were heading for there is Timor, which we see outlined in red, and they basically, this was the last point of easy navigation. In fact, it would appear after they were chased by these Torres Strait Islanders that they headed for what's known as Arnhem Land here and then went to Timor. Now, to hit that with rudimentary navigation equipment is quite hard. But I will tell you that if we look at this eastern end of Timor and the western end, the distance is about the same from Newcastle on Tyne down to Land's End. So if you think about that, it becomes a little easier to imagine hitting it. And of course, Timor was divided into two separate parts. West Timor, which was controlled in these days by the Dutch, it's now part of Indonesia, and East Timor, which in these days was controlled by the Portuguese, and is now an independent country, even though it had to fight for its independence from Indonesia. Kupang, which is spelt so many different ways, depending what century you're in, is down here on the western end, and that's what they were basically aiming for. So if they hit anywhere on, and I keep pointing with my finger, I've got to point with this thing, if they hit anywhere on this coast, they knew basically to turn left and go around here. But it's still a long, over 1,000 miles to get there from Cape York Peninsula. When they arrived there, they claimed they were a whaling ship wreck, and one of the reasons they used a whaling ship was it was not unknown for some of the officers on a whaling ship to take their wife and children with them, and that's basically what Bryant claimed. The governor, Timotheus Wanjon, was once again very entranced with Mary. And one of the things I should say about Mary, or two things I should say about Mary, was one is that she was described as not a great beauty, and the other was that she was completely illiterate. All she could do was sign a cross. So the governor, Timotheus Wanjon, was very taken with Mary. He outfitted the all 11 people on board. He fed them, he housed them, and basically he was going to try and get the money back from the British government. But he was very welcoming to them. He'd had the experience 2 years previously of Bligh arriving from the mutiny on the Bounty. So, and he was very welcoming to them. Around the same time, a fellow called Captain Edward Edwards had been sent out by the Admiralty on HMS Pandora to find the bounty mutineers and to find the bounty more specifically. When he got to Tahiti, he actually found a number of the bounty mutineers. I think there were 14 of them with their wives, whatever you want to call them. And he actually captured them, and he put them into what was known, in fact, and become part of literature, is Pandora's box, which was a structure he'd built on the top on the deck of HMS Pandora. He, unlike Bougainville, felt that he could handle the Torres Strait, and that night, or one night, they were going through at about 12 knots or something or other, and struck hard, and HMS Pandora was wrecked. Edward Edwards himself refused to open Pandora's box and let out the mutineers, but the boatswain of the ship, in fact, took pity on them and let them out, and about 11 of them, in fact, were saved along with most of the crew. So where do they go? They head for Kupang. And there's once again several stories about what might have happened now. One of the stories is that Captain Edward Edwards immediately suspected the convicts of being exactly that. The other story that comes out is that William Bryant, because of the governor's attraction and care for Mary, and the fact that he felt that he'd done all the work in terms of getting from Sydney to Kupang, was drunk one night and admitted that they were in fact escaped convicts. Which story is true, I don't know, and once again, it's not documented. Edward Edwards chartered a Dutch flute called the Rembang to take the crew, the mutineers, and the escaped convicts to Batavia, where he hoped to then go on to England. The captain of the Rembang said Mary and the children, he put aside a cabin for them, and Edward Edwards said, no, these are convicts, and the issue of convicts, they will go in the hold with the rest of the convicts. And in fact, once again, we're not 100% clear, but it would appear that maybe Charlotte and Emmanuel, I should say, were chained, as well as, even at 4 years old and 1 year old. We don't know. But Edward Edwards was a martinet that made Bligh look like Princess Charlotte. Okay, they got to Batavia. It was known for its smell and its disease. And I've picked out a little painting there of a canal down the middle of Batavia, and it looks quite tropical and lovely, but evidently that is not the reputation. And I was recently told, in fact, when I gave this talk to a sailing group, that in fact the Indonesians are thinking about moving Jakarta, which is modern day Batavia, mainly because of still the problem with disease, particularly in the area. William Bryant and Emmanuel, 3 weeks apart, but both in December 1791, died of fever while they were in Batavia. So Edward Edwards at this stage still has chartered the Rembang. He couldn't find a ship going all the way to England, so he charters the Rembang to then go to Cape Town. On the way to Cape Town, we have Charlotte Bryant, William Morton, who you might remember was the navigator, James Sims and James Cox die on the way. This actually means that Mary now has lost all her family, her husband, William, her son, Emmanuel, and her daughter, Charlotte. When they arrive at Cape Town, there is the HMS Gorgon, which has just come from the colony at New South Wales. On board is Watkin Tench, who's finished his period there. And he has, once again, he notes the fact of the bravery of Mary in having made the trip and actually finding Kupang in Timor. What have they got waiting for them in England? Mary actually originally had been convicted and sentenced to hang, but in fact that had been commuted to transportation for life. So what she would expect when she got to Newgate, and some of the other prisoners would expect, would be to be hanged. So they weren't looking forward to the voyage on HMS Gorgon, which was actually in much better conditions than Edward Edwards had allowed them on the Rembang all the way back to Britain. However, they arrive in Britain and they're immediately celebrated as having made this wonderful voyage from New South Wales to Timor. And they were in Newgate Prison, and one of the things you could do in those days is pay to go and visit celebrities, and Mary and the other convicts that had made it to London were considered celebrities. One of the people who went to visit them was James Boswell. Now, you may know Boswell from his biography. In fact, he developed the genre of biography of Dr. Johnson. But he was also a great barrister of his day, but not so much that he was a great courtroom person. He knew everybody, and as a result, he probably got people, the conviction turned over, etc., because of his knowledge of who people were. One of the people he knew, he'd been to school with, was Henry Dundas, who was the Home Secretary at the time. And even though they couldn't stand each other, he went round and basically sat in Dundas's office until Mary received a pardon. He was actually, once again, quite taken with Mary. The pamphleteers of the time made much of Boswell and Mary, and all sorts of aspersions were cast on the relationship that occurred between them. But in fact, it's generally believed now that in fact nothing occurred between Boswell and Mary. But he did settle, while he was alive, £10 a year on her. And he taught her, oddly enough, to sign her initials. So she would sign MB. We don't really know if the MB was for Mary Broad or Mary Bryant, but that was the first, that's as literate as she ever became, as far as we're aware. He also arranged for the pardon for the other surviving convicts. He felt that the the treatment they'd, just to make the voyage, and the treatment they'd received at the hand of Captain Edward Edwards was punishment enough. What happened to Mary? We know she, after 6 months in London, one of the other things Boswell did, he found Dolly, or Grace Broad, who was Mary's sister, was in service in London, and he reunited them. Mary was evidently had a lot of trepidation about meeting Dolly, mainly because she felt that the family may, because she'd been convicted as a highwayman, may not want anything to do with it. But Grace, oddly enough, welcomed her with open arms. Mary then returned to Foy. Now, a woman called Judith Cook has written a book called To Brave Every Danger. And one of the last things she did, or the last thing she wrote in the book, is she started looking around to find any trace of Mary at all from 1793 onwards. She did actually find that Mary Broad married a Richard Thomas somewhere south of Helston on the Lizard, and settled there, and they had 2 children. The age of Mary Broad was very similar to what Mary Broad / Bryant would have been, and she'd like to believe that. The other interesting thing is, in the church register, she's actually signed just MB, which is what James Boswell had taught her to sign. You might not be interested, but I'm interested in the fact that what the voyage they made, whether it was Mary who was in command, or William Bryant who was in command, or William Morton who was in command, or James Martin who was in command, was absolutely extraordinary. We see there a quadrant, and a quadrant was one of the instruments, and a compass was given to them by Detmar Smith in Sydney Harbour. But a quadrant, unlike a modern GPS, doesn't give you latitude and longitude. To make it work, you need a nautical almanac, which I doubt they had, and a chronometer, which, if they had, was probably not keeping accurate time. It is possible to measure the distance between stars and or other, particularly planets, and try and work out the time. But I'm not sure the spherical trigonometry required was part of, other than, we don't know much about William Morton. Maybe he had the capability, but I think that they were lucky to hit Timor as such, and to make that voyage and to survive. And once again, like Bligh, not one person on the voyage between Sydney and Kupang was lost, even though they were had spears being thrown at them, and they were short of water, and they went through storms and etc. So once again, an extraordinary woman, even if she wasn't in command, and an extraordinary voyage made by those people. Now that, for a remarkable woman, is the end. So what do I do now, Debbie? Do I stop screen sharing?
If you could stop the screen sharing.
There we go.
Lovely. Gosh,
Any questions?
yes, we've
I'll
had a
try to
couple
leave
of
them.
questions. I will never forget the Michelin 4 tire comment.
Good.
And I salute your seasonal focus on that naval chart. I saw Yule Channel.
Oh,
So I salute your seasonality, sir.
did you see Wednesday Island? But it's Thursday. I should have actually shown Thursday Island.
Oh dear. If anyone has additional questions, you can type them in, but I'll start with what I have. How did you become interested in Mary Broad Bryant?
That's interesting. You may have heard of a fellow called Thomas Keneally, who wrote a book.
Yeah.
He wrote a book called Schindler's Ark, I think it was, in which they made the book Schindler's List. His daughter is also a novelist, and she wrote a book called Fled. Her name is Meg Keneally, and I was given it, I think, about 2 Christmases ago. And it's fictional. She's actually taken the story of Mary Bryant and basically made a fictional story around what she knows. So there are some elements of the bodice rippers in there and some elements of fact and some stuff she made up. One of the things that disappoints me about a lot of the books is that when a historian doesn't know facts, they tend to make them up. And I think that's one of the cases with Mary Bryant. But it's to do with the book Fled by Meg Keneally, which is in the Buckinghamshire Library system, I can tell you that.
Ooh. Ooh.
I think it's even online, and an e-book.
2 more questions. One is, do you happen to know where Lieutenant Bradley's watercolors / journal are kept?
Yes. Well, in fact,
can you tell us?
The Mitchell Library in Sydney. And the Mitchell Library is the major reference library in Sydney.
Polly is there. Can I see some more names?
Oh, someone is. Here we go. There we go. Right. The last question I think I have so far, is someone's noted Mary was the only woman who escaped from the colony. Is that because she didn't befriend other women, or she got rid of them so she had all of the men, or why was she the only woman?
I think it's probably interesting enough. We don't really know what happened to her 2 co-highway persons who were both women. One of them did end up in New South Wales. What happened to the other one, we don't know. There was, once again, if you read some of the...
Maybe we'll get some more people. There's a blue arrow there.
Is that Martin Lorette? There you go. Okay.
If you read some of the, once again, the history that's been written, there was a falling out between Mary and one of her co-highway people while they were in the colony. But I'd say that, once again, they were trying to keep it as secret as possible, because if anyone found out they were going to use the governor's cutter, how they got the 11 people together. Once again, there's no record of where we know why they want William Morton, because he was a navigator. We know why they wanted William Bryant, because he had access to the boat. Mary probably beat him around the head enough that he took her and her 2 children. Or maybe she said, well, if you go off without me, I'm going to tell, if you talk about going off without me, I'm going to tell the governor, you see. So, or what contempt. She liked having conversations, oddly enough, with Mary, even though she was illiterate.
Oh, honestly. Super. Are there any other questions to be submitted, or should I hand over to Linda? I think that's it on questions. Linda, can you unmute yourself and turn your video on?
All done.
Thank you.
Well, it's my great pleasure to have been asked to thank you, John. I was delighted that you chose to talk about Mary Bryant, a most interesting woman, but actually to do it from a proper historical view, because the films that have been made and the television programs are so much, I'm trying to think what you call them, the bodice rippers. Yes, and they really are. And so it's always a pleasure to actually hear the real story. and you've given us a real insight into her life and the life of the period, the other people that she was with and what would have happened to so many of them. So it was good to hear from someone who really knew their subject, and you communicated it so well. And I promise I laughed about the Chinese meal, even if you couldn't hear me. But so thank you from all of us, and we wish you a very happy Christmas to you and all of your family. And from all of the committee to all of our members, we wish you a very happy Christmas. And can I say, I look forward to seeing you all on the 14th of January on our first visit, a virtual visit, but our first visit of the new year.
Thank you, Linda.
Lovely. Well, we can keep this open for a while. If anyone wants to chat or wave, if you unmute yourselves and turn your videos back on.
Now we're allowed to do it. It's only just been told we can do it.
You're allowed. You're on.
Do mine. Yeah, mine won't come undone.
Oh, you're speaking. Whoever just said won't come undone.
That's Heather, Debbie. Mine
Oh, okay. Heather, do you need your video on?
Yeah, it won't come on. It says
right.
the host won't let me.
I will.
It won't come on. We have to wait.
As it can't
Else.
get that
We didn't
message.
take ourselves off before they did it.
Okay, I think sometimes what we can do is if the host.
Hey,
yeah,
Mary, we have you.
Good. Sometimes we have to invite, but you did it.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, great. Yes. Well, I'm pleased I'm not Mary Bryant.
So we have to clap.
Oh.
Do you think she saw off the other women?
No. None of the other women would have wanted to do a trip like that. Come on. She must have been crackers.
Oh, dear. Yeah.
They can't see us clap.
But it put me off cruising.
Now we're up. Yeah, should be asked to it.
Well done, Martin.
Yes.
Now I'm, yeah.
Let me just interrupt. It turns out that the host needs to invite you to start your video.
Yeah, and that's what we've
So
done.
I'm going down the list, trying. Oh, some of you have succeeded.
Yep, there's the Oaktons.
I'm just asking Abby to open her video.
She probably doesn't want to.
Well, but
invited, but and then I.
About John.
Heather, can I ask you to perhaps just say something about the visit?
I think you should.
You can, Linda.
Okay. My cryptic comment just at the end of my thank you to John was that you may remember that earlier this year I had arranged a visit to the Vintners Hall, and I postponed it then because the forecast was for horrendous storms, which then only materialized in a very minor way, but nonetheless we were stuck, and then of course we were all in lockdown, and I have postponed it twice. However, I am now absolutely delighted to say that I have been able to rearrange our visit to the Vintners Hall. We have a blue badge guide, and he is also a liveryman of Vintners Hall who will be walking us through, and we will be able to visit parts of the building that are too small for a tour, but he will take his camera. I understand we're going down into the cellars. And the important thing is, of course, the Vintners Hall, by its very name, has always been involved in the wine trade, but they are also responsible for the swan upping on the River Thames on behalf of the Queen. So he will be talking about that and showing us their wonderful building. And it is at 10:30 on Thursday, the 14th of January, and there will be a flyer going out, so keep an eye out for it. I don't know when our wonderful publicity machine will be going into action. I've been a little late in providing her with all the information. But the Zoom details will not be available to you immediately, but they will be going out. So 14th of January, put it in your diary now. It's in addition to our normal lectures, but there is no extra cost because we won't have a coach, but you do have to provide your own coffee and bun. Sorry.
Oh, dear. Oh, dear. And may I say to Linda, or to the rest of the members, Linda has worked tirelessly trying to organize the Vintners Hall to give us a tour, and started balls rolling that grew into big balls, but didn't quite work for what you'd intended, Linda, did it? So January 14th by noon, I will be applauding you that we finally got there. So Heather, do you see anyone you recognize on the screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi guys, down at Beaumont Way. I'm pleased you joined to have a look.
John, for some reason, your screen's gone yellow. Or is
Oh
it
yes,
just
he's underwater now.
Sunshine.
It goes underwater at certain times.
underwater? I hope not.
Yes, yes.
John, do you have another trip planned, or are you going to wait for warmer weather?
I'm waiting for warmer weather. I was supposed to sail to the Azores this year, but that's been postponed. It's a race, and that's been postponed till next year. And then 2022, I'm supposed to get my 4th medal from the Newport,
It's in this country.
Rhode Island.
Wow.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Well, maybe in the
Crazy but
future we can-
admirable.
Maybe in the future you can talk to us about some of your voyages.
No, Linda,
I've
no way. If you
wonderful
saw the
wife.
boat and the shoes and the oven, not a good idea.
Oh, you mean the video's not a good idea? The subject may be.
Mhm.
How nice to see everybody.
Yeah. Nice to see you, Ioka.
And the virtual walk, I think when it's going to be wet possibly and cold and dark and whatever, virtual walk sounds fantastic. It's a great idea. And maybe we should do it even going forward when life opens up.
Yeah. Maybe get a real bus.
Well, the coach company would love us too.
Oh,
They are hurting.
yep. Yep.
I should remind everybody that many of the great houses we are so blessed in Buckinghamshire, they are open, or the gardens are, and many of them are laying on wonderful Christmas displays, even some Christmas markets, because they're in the open air. But they've got all of their Christmas lights up, and they look quite spectacular. So you can go there in a car, maybe with a couple of members of your family, or
Bit difficult. We're in tier 3 now.
yes, it is. But hopefully we might come out of it again.
You reckon?
If we're being very, very good, you never know. We might come out. But don't forget you've got the 5 days of Christmas to take a little tootle. And it's
Bear the consequences.
well, no, even in tier 3 you can go for a walk
On your own, yeah.
Yeah.
well with your partner or somebody. Actually, you could go for a walk with Peter, Susan. Sorry, Peter.
Well, I must say the timing of the tier 3 announcement with my groceries delivery was unfortunate. So I'm not sure which of my boys are coming for our outdoor dining venue Christmas Day and the book club I was to have had here in the party barn, which used to be the carport. But I've got 5 or 6 large containers of cream cheese for the various recipes I was going to make. So you may find, some of you, little surprise packages on your front step if I can't freeze cream cheese. But if that's the most difficult thing, I'm very lucky. So
Yes, that's right. We're lucky to have not had it.
knock
so
on
far.
wood. Yes.
Yeah. Our society seems to have survived fairly well.
I'm going to say, see you all
Cheerio.
next year. I'll see you,
See you
at
in the new year.
walk.
Happy Christmas and New Year to everybody.
Yes.
Yeah.
See you all in the new year.
A better New
Yes,
Year.
See
I
you
don't
all
have
in
to
the new
break
year.
up.
Happy Christmas.
Happy
Christmas.
New Year.
John,
Happy
very
Christmas.
much.
Bye.
I now
Hi.
know where Bradley Point is. We're next there.
Hi.
Bye.
Lorette, I hope you're well now.
Yes, I'm well. Can I just say to John, thank you for reminding me of my uncle in South Island, New Zealand. The voice.
The
I thought you
Antipodean
meant that
voice.
I thought you meant he was a convict.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great.
Right.
Good. Yep. 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 Until 2021. Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. A good year.
Nice to see you, Ayuko. Are you well?
Thank you.
You're muted.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. You look very well.
Yes, I'm well.
Great, great.
Yeah, as long as I have my books and my Zoom, I'm very happy.
Yeah. You're content. That's good. It's a very hard time for everybody, isn't it?
It is, but it's also been interesting to learn new things and learn new ways of doing things.
Yeah.
But there's been such wonderful things available online, programs to watch, lectures to listen to.
Yeah.
I think it's been, it's made me think about doing different things. It's good.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
There's always a positive side to everything.
Yeah, yeah.
It's good to see you, and I wish you a very happy New Year.
Lovely to see you. Same to you.
I look forward to seeing you in reality.
Yes, yes. New Year. After New Year.
Goodbye, everyone.
Let's hope. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Take care.
Down to 6 participants.
Yeah, no, I think actually we had, yeah, I think we had more at one point. Yeah, that's okay. Well, I hope you've remembered the 14th of January, but you'll get a notification about that in the next day. It's on Vintners Hall. I don't know whether it's just Vintners Hall, but yeah. But that because he hasn't got anybody with us, he apparently will take us into the wine cellars. So you'll get to places you would never normally get to. That's all right. Thank you, Polly. Bye. Sorry.
Yeah.
So how did you feel from your end?
Yeah, that was okay, I think, really.
There was that lady Stark who was neither in the meeting.
No, Maureen, yes. Well, apparently she must have 2 devices or something. I'll check with her because Dorothy knows her quite well.
Okay, I thought from what you'd said when we spoke that she must have had 2 devices and come in some other way. But
so one of them somehow got stuck in a joining.
I've never seen that before.
All right, but the other attempt was successful.
Yeah, at least I had one.
Yeah. So
that's absolutely brilliant. So so you're all set up to do the next one then?
I guess so, really, yes.
I actually managed to put this onto YouTube.
Right.
But sadly, I was told not to record it, which was really annoying because I would have liked to have shared it.
Right, yes.
But at least I now know I can do it on YouTube, so people will be able to watch future things on their telly.
Right, yes. Yes, I realise that when I phoned you up just before the meeting, I should really have just used chat for that, shouldn't I?
Yes, you can just use chat. I didn't. Yeah, I didn't.
Yes.
I didn't tell you that because I just thought I was telling you so many different things at once. I think the thing is that it's easier to do it than to explain how to do it. Do you know what I mean? It's one of those things that is actually simpler when you're actually doing it.
Right, yes.
But it is quite interesting. And I can actually create a list of everybody who attended from Zoom.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the accuracy depends on, people actually having the right name, which sometimes they don't on their devices.
Right.
People can rename themselves.
Yes.
But they don't tend to.
No.
But if you want to log in and have a look at the account anytime, and just have a look around at the different settings.
Right, yes.
One thing I didn't show you, which I may as well just show you now. I'll just cue the host.
Right.
And supposed to the co-host, and then you'll see you get one extra button, which is a security shield. So you'll get that up now. It's gone away from me. Can you see on the bottom line next to participants?
Yes.
There's a shield. And if you click the security thing, that's the thing where you can stop people unmuting themselves or stop people. So that really we should probably be using that. But I've been sort of using the global powers sparingly, if you know what I mean. But that would stop anybody inadvertently coming in, and then you change that back just before the end so that everybody can come in and change their video settings, etc.
Right. Which setting exactly are you talking about?
Well, if you hit security, I can't see it now.
No.
Then there's a list of options, and you say you can tick what you allow. So you're allowing people to unmute themselves or unvideo, turn their videos on.
So
and you can either lock that down, so you can go into the meeting and lock it, and then you can unlock it when you're ready. So, I mean, mostly there was one person who interrupted, wasn't there at one point, but I think because there's always 2 or 3 people who are on as host, there's likelihood that somebody will work out who it is and stop it.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I'm delighted that the YouTube thing worked.
Right.
Just very
yeah
frustrated that I wasn't allowed to record it. Because he was worried about copyright material, but all of it was 18th century, so I shouldn't think as much that
right, yeah.
Mary Bryant's not going to come back and
no, not really.
Complain about the copyright. So that's absolutely brilliant, because that actually takes the pressure right off now, because now I don't need to make absolutely 100% sure I'm there all the time, because Paul did the last one.
Yes.
And so now it's you and Paul, and if anybody else, we can get anybody else on, that would be great, just to have you know, variety of faces and extra help. But if there's anything, I would at some point, maybe if you fancy it, just have a look at the account and see whether you can see what the settings are, etc.
Right. Yes. Yeah. That'd be
or if you thought of any other questions, we can just have another chat. So it is a good product, isn't it, in terms of being able to.
Yes, very much so. Yeah.
Set up different things.
So we seem to have got two other names.
I think they may have walked away and forgotten to.
Maybe it's that simple. Yes, probably.
to go on, but it's nice. Yes, we're probably boring them. If they haven't gone away, they will probably have gone away now.
Right, yes.
I just had a phone call from somebody who was who lives down the road, and she joined the lecture, and she was just saying she was glad she joined in. So
yes,
that was nice.
A lot of people came late, didn't they?
Yes, that's the thing. You can lock the meeting, but I thought, I just think that's a bit. I mean, you have to pounce on them to make sure they're muted straight away, so there's no question that they'll interrupt the meeting, etc.
Right. Yes.
But I've let them in, but that's more late people than we've ever had. But then it's the afternoon, and maybe they're
strange time.
Yeah, and they didn't get as much warning for this one. Somebody sent me a bit of a curt letter from Chalfont saying we didn't have enough warning or something.
Oh, right. Okay.
Partly done that because first we hadn't agreed that we were going to let Chalfont in, and then I thought we were going to record it. So I thought, well, if I gave them 1 day's less notice, it wouldn't matter because I'll just send them the link.
Yes.
But sadly, they were worried. Well, have a lovely Christmas, Brian.
You too, yes.
And I hope your car gets sorted out.
Right, yeah, it'll be interesting to speak to Persia, see what they say. Yeah.
They've made cars so much more complicated than they used to.
That's right.
Error codes.
It does limit what the average AA man can do for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
They must get very frustrated.
Yes. So
I will. I'll leave, and you can end the meeting. You'll still be
host. Yes. Okay then. Fine.
I mean, you can see now how you assign host. Can you actually? If you just click on me, you can.
Yes. Yeah.
You can make.
And the participants.
You can change the.
Oh.
Yeah. Change whatever you do.
Yeah. Yeah. No problem.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Yeah, mine's self-explanatory because it says the Art Society Chilterns, but maybe if you were host, say the next time, it probably is worth writing host next to you. You can rename yourself. So then people will know.
Right.
Anyway, I shall shut this down and go and shut down the YouTube feed as well.
Right, yes.
I was amazed that it worked. I wasn't 100% sure.
All right. Yeah, well
Just
done.
very frustrated about not being able to record it though. So
Yes.
out something else. And you can see how you record the meetings, by the way. That's just another button on the bottom.
Yes, I've seen that. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, well, I will say goodbye.
Yep. Okay. Bye for now.
Bye.
Yeah. Thanks.